Hello, everybody. I hope you are doing all fine. This session is going to be in English. My name is Karine Gentelet, and I am professor of social science at Université du Québec en Outaouais, and also shareholder of Abeona ENS Ovia share on social justice and artificial intelligence. And I am here with my colleague, Celine Castorana. Celine, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Celine Castorana. I'm a law professor at the University of Ottawa, Civil Law Faculty, and I also hold a chair on accountable AI in a digital context, and we are very glad to have Rachel Adams with us.
Thank you, Celine. So the conference is organized by the International Observatory on the Societal Impacts of AI and Digital Technology. And before we start, and as we will be talking about decolonization, I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am located on unceded indigenous land. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and water on which I am today. This land is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other people. I respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationship with Indigenous and other people within the Montreal community. So you understood that I am located in Montreal. Today we have, as Celine mentioned, we have the pleasure to receive Dr. Rachel Adams. Dr. Rachel Adams is the principal researcher at Research ICT Africa, which she directs the AI for the Africa Just AI Center. This is a project lead of the African Observatory on the Responsible AI, and she is the principal investigator of the Global Index on Responsible AI. Rachel is a member of the UNESCO Expert Committee for the implementation of the UNESCO Recommendation on the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence, an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Center for Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge, a research associate, with the Information Law and Policy Center at the University of London, and a research associate of the Teya Risha African Center of Excellence on Digital Governance at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Rachel has published widely in an area such as AI and society, gender and AI, transparency, open data, and data protection. Rachel is also the author of Transparency, New Trajectories in Law, published at Routledge in 2020, and the lead author of Human Rights and the Fourth Industrial Revolution in South Africa. It's forthcoming, has been published in 2021. And the topic of presentation is Decolonizing AI, Ethics and the Rule of Law. So I'm going to start to share your presentation. Just give me a second. It was working when we try it. So now I have to find it.
Maybe Edine, you can speak about the question from the...
Yeah, Edine, please.
Yes, certainly. So hi, everyone. And basically, I just want to mention that we will be taking questions during all the presentation. You'll be able to ask your question on the section Q&A on your screen. And at the end of Rachel's presentation, we'll be able to ask your question to the speaker. And also, if there are some French speakers here, you're glad to ask your question in French, and we'll be able to introduce the questions to Rachel so she can understand and answer.
Okay, so the floor is yours, Rachel.
Thank you ever so much. It is such an honor to be here with the Obvia team, whose work I followed for some time. So thank you, Jiam and Karim, Celine and Dean for the invitation. My work over the past few years, I'm based in Cape Town in South Africa, has been to examine some of the longer term implications of artificial intelligence, particularly in African societies. I think I take a big concern around what I see as an increasing divide between the North and the South. And I'm interested in the role of artificial intelligence in exacerbating this divide. So I'm going to talk today about decolonizing artificial intelligence, which has been a theme of my work for a number of years. I'm going to talk about what that means. It is a book project that I'm working on, and this is one chapter of many. It's a broad, difficult, and very complex topic, but I want to speak about the concept of ethics today. Ethics is this key idea within the discourse of AI, which has received very little critical attention itself. So calls to decolonize artificial intelligence have arisen from across the world, championed by critical scholars of AI and AI ethics, all from indigenous groups from Hawaii to Canada to New Zealand that are practicing and developing artificial intelligence techniques on their own terms. These calls echo a growing global consciousness to attend to the debris left by the European empires of modernity and to respond to increasing instances of injustice and discrimination arising within the AI industry, discipline and practice, which bear the mark of racial inequality and settler dispossession. We can move to the first slide, please. So, for example, and although not well evidenced and certainly hard to trace, the algorithmic organization of content on social media platforms has ostensibly played a role in exacerbating ethnic and political tensions in countries across the global south in particular. Do see there's a report from The Continent publication. It's called The Continent. It comes out every week on Facebook's role in fueling the violence in Ethiopia. And you can see the Continent magazine there, or the takedown of anti-colonial and anti-racial content from social media, as we have witnessed with the complicity of Twitter and Facebook in the Kashmir incidences, Israel and Palestine, Nigeria and Myanmar, among many others. There are further many other instances where AI has demonstrated critical racial biases, to the extent where we must consider whether the technology itself is inherently racializing, sorting people and behavior according to socially ascribed designations and categories. Such instances cross a wide range of AI-driven technologies, from targeted advertisements to facial recognition or the use of AI to predict criminal behavior and intent. These systems have demonstrably affected those historically oppressed by slavery and colonialism, now automating the discrimination and inequality that these histories first introduced. At a more general level, questions of decolonization have arisen in relation to the will of big tech to commodify all human experience as data points that feed insatiable AI systems, which require ever more data input in order to boost efficiency and accuracy. Nick Coldry and Ulysses Mayas speak of this as data colonialism, exploring how human experience is being appropriated as capital in an increasingly data-driven market. Yet these processes are as political as they are capitalistic, and we do not all pay the same price. Its politics is hegemony, its industry monopoly, but the state does not have monopoly over the politics, and the industry plays its part in the diffusion of hegemony well beyond the borders of the nation state. Indeed, the current state of the art of artificial intelligence, broadly considered now to be the world's most powerful technology, requires a polymorphous state-industry nexus to sustain itself. The permutations of this complex look different in different contexts and make the central imperial power of AI, if there is one, hard to locate. This complex, despite being largely unseen, plays itself out on a planetary scale. It is sustained by an expanding web of material resources spreading out across the globe. The infrastructure, hardware, and bodies required to build and grow this empire of AI are extracted in practices which mimic historical colonialism and may very well worsen the state of global inequality. And in the totalizing mission of the AI complex, peripheral or non-normative ways of being and knowing are threatened, including directly with the extinction of indigenous knowledges and languages that cannot yet be computed, or indirectly as social and political life becomes shackled to a statistically determined norm that can be defined, predicted, and governed. Ethics has been posited as the key tool for addressing all the various harms associated with AI. It is also deeply bound up in the governance tools employed or not employed by social media platforms to regulate certain online content. Ethical principles and guidelines have proliferated that seek to embed more ethical practices in the design, development, and rollout of AI, with the hope that AI can support more just outcomes. So today, I want to look more closely at the notion of ethics, which itself has been subject to very little critical attention, and the role it is playing in the discourse and practices of AI. My approach and my intention is decoloniality. So this work continues the mounting decolonial critique and appraisal of AI and seeks to contribute to the work of decolonizing AI. So I'll start with a brief discussion on what I mean by decolonization, and we can move to the next slide, please. So decolonization is a refracted term, depending on who is speaking, where you are speaking from, and all the context that informs this particular speaking moment. Decolonial thought is, of course, far more than a tool to problematize artificial intelligence. Instead, it is an invocation to make sense of, to invalidate, and to abolish the logics and politics of race and coloniality that continue to exclude and degrade other ways of knowing, living, and being that do not ascribe to the hegemony of imperial reason. It is not a form of academic critique, but an insurgent political strategy against colonial power in all its forms and modalities. To understand what decoloniality must counter, we must understand the nature of the extreme form of power colonialism built and introduced into the world. This power is a power over, a deathly power of denial, injustice, and negation. It is a power that denies the freedom, dignity, and very humanity of those it oppresses and takes this to bloat the supremacy of those it serves. It is a power, the effects of which are fundamentally de-equalizing, where equality means the recognition of the intrinsic human worth of every life. The modalities and effects of this de-equalization, which is a term I borrow from Annabelle Quijano, as they have arisen from historical colonial practices, is precisely what decoloniality must attend to. As the French Algerian critic of colonialism, Albert Memmi, describes, colonialism created lasting conditions of poverty for the colonized and an impoverishment of the mind that affects both the colonized and the colonizer. But race is colonialism's central creed, an invented marker of human difference and worth. And gender, distinctly Western and binary notions of gender, is the technology through which race and the fundamental de-equalization of humanity is produced through generations and over time. In its ultimate form, colonial power over became apartheid and the creation of what my colleague Shepo Madeline Ngozi names a world of apartness. Formalized here in South Africa, worlds of apartness are continually created and upheld in regimes of de-equalization. That is, systems and structures of racial and gendered bifurcation that mark, divide, categorize, classify, and hierarchize individuals according to social norms of undesirability. My work has been to explore AI precisely as one of these new regimes of de-equalization. In my work, I consider AI as an imaginative desire manifest through a global industry to achieve and consummate the ultimate superiority of humankind over this world. In this way, AI is a radical extension of what colonialism began, insofar as colonialism was concerned with the violent extension of European superiority over life and land elsewhere. In fact, AI can be thought of as providing the colonial machine with the tools to run smoother, to conceal its operations in technological determinism and fix its subjects in states of privilege or states of oppression that creates greater bifurcation and hinders the possibility of a truly post-colonial human community and belonging. But of course, the colonialism in which AI is bound up today does not neatly continue and parallel historical European colonialism. Our task is to critically engage with the oscillating historical traces of colonialism in the oppressive practices associated with AI today, and to find expression for the new ways in which old forms of power continue their work of de-equalization. So I'm going to turn now to two perhaps fairly well-cited cases where we can tease out some of the questions I'd like to pose in relation to ethics. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So in 2018, the name Cambridge Analytica exploded on the world scene, provoking shock and uproar in relation to the company's practices and uses of personal data scraped from Facebook and influencing two major political events of the Western world: the election of Donald Trump in the United States and the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom. The wide-scale distrust in the political institutions of two of the world's supposedly foremost democracies that ensued was unprecedented and profound. But equally, it was a watershed moment in public understanding of the power of companies like Facebook in developing data-driven algorithmic tools that could actively shape people's very understanding and opinions of the world in which they live, ultimately influencing their behavior in elections and other political activities. But these data-driven manipulation tools were not used for the first time in the 2016 US presidential campaign or the UK Brexit referendum of the same year. In fact, they were trialed and tested in the Global South before being taken to the world stage in 2016. So one of the key early testing sites was Trinidad and Tobago in the months prior to their 2010 presidential elections. Cambridge Analytica's parent company, aptly named Strategic Communications Laboratories, was commissioned by the opposition coalition party called the People's Partnership to develop data-driven election marketing strategies and tools. Historically, the voting population of Trinidad and Tobago has been sharply divided along two key ethnic lines: the Afro-Trinidadian that supported the People's National Movement, the main political party in Trinidad and Tobago since independence, and the party currently in power prior to the 2010 elections. So that was on the one side. And then on the other, the Indo-Trinidadian ethnic line, who broadly supported the lead political party of the opposition coalition, the People's Partnership. So one of the key tactics which Cambridge Analytica's parent company, Strategic Communications Laboratories, employed was to influence, in order to influence the outcome of the elections, were campaigns to dissuade young Afro-Trinidadians from voting. So this was to be a tactic that this company would then later use in the 2015 Nigerian elections, where they similarly conducted a campaign to refrain the youth from engaging in the election processes and voting. So much of the data analytics underlying these tools were based on psychometric assessments to determine, predict, and shape public perceptions. I don't have time today to go into this in detail, but if anyone is interested, Michael Wintraub has done some really interesting work tracing the data analytics employed by SCL and Cambridge Analytica, particularly in the 2016 Trump presidential campaigns, back to their eugenic roots, and showing the profoundly racializing effects and objectives of such tools. In any event, and as explicitly articulated by Christopher Wiley, the Cambridge Analytica whistleblower, in his book, the Trinidadian election of 2010 was an occasion whereby SCL could use the country as an ideal laboratory to run our experiments at scale. So I want to return to this language of laboratory and experiments. The second case, and if we could move on, please, to the next slide, is an example in Zimbabwe, which is much closer to where I am based, where a deal was signed in 2018 between the Chinese facial recognition company CloudWalk and the Zimbabwean government to install surveillance and facial recognition infrastructure in the country. In return, CloudWalk would have access to the facial biometric data of the Zimbabwean National Population Registry, which holds picture records of the faces of millions of Zimbabweans. The deal was signed in March 2018, just a few months before the first national election, which was to take place in July 2018. And it was to be the first election since the passing of Robert Mugabe, who had been president since the country's independence over 30 years prior. During the election period, there were various different processes and requirements at play with regard to requiring people to register their biometric details on the national database before voting. But it ultimately created a whole load of distrust around both the election process and the use of digital biometrics, which many people, particularly in rural parts of the country, did not fully understand what they were for or what would be done with their data. In addition, the deal was arranged at a time when issues around racial bias in AI and the non-recognition of Black and African faces by facial recognition technologies was peaking, following the gender shades work of Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gedbru. And companies like CloudWalk were under increasing pressure to make their technologies less biased and therefore more ethical by ensuring the data on which the technology's algorithms were trained was more ethnically representative. The facial recognition data, which CloudWalk had access to from the deal with the Zimbabwean government, would have been a treasure trove for a company seeking to cement their place in international AI markets where ethical considerations were focused only on the extent of biased outcomes in the system, rather than the provenance of the data used to ensure the algorithm's supposed fairness. We can move on to the next slide, please. So in both these examples, the idea of ethics and of AI ethics plays out in different ways, which I want to go into in more detail. As mentioned, ethics has arisen as the key framework to be drawn upon to ensure AI is not harmful to society. We may already wish to ask, harmful to which society? Indeed, the emerging discourse around ethics and decolonizing AI has yet to develop critical thought around the idea of ethics itself, Despite recognition that the dominant ethical values found in AI ethics frameworks are centered on Eurocentric ideas of morality, legality and governance, and individual personhood. This ethics has, however, a critical history as the foundation for Europe's claim of supremacy over the people and places it colonized. Canley et al. Write about how colonialism came with a bifurcation of the sacred and the profane, or the ethical and the non-ethical. If it was not considered civil by the colonizers, it was uncivil, savage, profane, and repulsive. If it was approved by the colonial powers, then it was modern, civil, morally good, and sacred. The law was the instrument through which ethical notions were to be enforced and policed. So in this rendering, the idea of ethics is situated as a value supreme of Europe, proselytized on the global South, which is in turn, and in relation to the ethical West, positioned as what Achille Mbembe has called pre-ethical. Indeed, that Europe believed itself to be helping and protecting its colonies constituted the dominant rationale of the civilizing mission of colonialism, with ethics as its veneer. This served two functions. First, to justify colonialism itself as Western benevolence, and second, in rendering the colonies pre-ethical. The West could use these places as laboratories for scientific progress without guilt, where the collateral damage of scientific advancement could be safely imbibed in places and by people considered expendable. In an echo of colonial sentiment, the ethical and legal standards for AI that are arising largely from the West are considered by Europe particularly to constitute its critical edge in the AI arms race. Little critical thought has been developed, however, around the idea of ethics and the work it has played in justifying colonial violence. That decoloniality is now appearing as a new critical edge within the AI ethics discourse poses another concern. Should decoloniality be subsumed as a new tool for AI ethics without critique of the way in which the idea of ethics has been historically put to work in rationalizing colonial practices, runs the risk of appropriating decoloniality as an abstract metaphor and reperforming the very problematic of recentering whiteness that Eve, Tuck, and Wayne Yang in their work on the decolonial metaphor warn against. In 2019, a study that's been very, very well cited was published in Nature that identified over 84 ethical standards for the use and development of AI developed globally in the previous 5 years. Despite being titled The Global Landscape of AI Ethics Guidelines, among those 84 standards listed then, none arose from the African continent or even the global South. Most were developed in the USA, the UK, or by international bodies. As benchmarks for ethics, these standards being deployed are paternalistically positioned as universal, applicable for all, everywhere. In both cases, the Cambridge Analytica case and the CloudWalk case in Zimbabwe, the scene of the global South is adopted as a place where ethics as such is yet to be fully established, and where AI systems can either be beta tested in an environment where the moral fallout supposedly doesn't matter as much, or where the fairness of an AI system can be strengthened through the exploitation of data from people who are not, by reason, considered fully ethical agents. This follows the now centuries-old conceit of what Jan Smuts euphemistically called the laboratory of Africa in a lecture he gave in Oxford in 1930, where the collateral damage of scientific advancement could be safely imbibed in places and by people considered expendable. In the instances described above, the idea of ethics then is situated as a value supreme of the Occidental world to be proselytized on the supposedly pre-ethical global South region. Yet, as ethics was put to work to justify both the civilizing mission of colonialism and the utilization of Africa or the global South as a laboratory for Western scientific progress, it performed another conceit of the colonial order of things, that Western reason and Western ethics was neutral, universal, and objective, and could and should be dislocated from the context in which it arose and applied elsewhere. So positioned as this point zero from which to survey the world, Western knowledge and rationality claimed an irrefutable ascendancy to offer the only real way of knowing and understanding and being in the world. This is a critical problematic named within decolonial thought and a central assumption too within artificial intelligence and its technologies, that intelligence and the production of knowledge can be outsourced to a machine presupposes such knowledge to be both separable from the context in which it was produced and applicable to other contexts and realities. We see this problematic in relation to ethics manifesting in cases where ethics is also used by Western AI companies to shield themselves from accountability where harms arise. In the case of Facebook's role in the Myanmar genocide, for example, Facebook relied on the notion of privacy, one of the key cornerstones of AI ethics, to prevent access to records of the Facebook posts of key Myanmar officials that were requested by the Gambia in order to build a case for the International Court of Justice. There are, however, alternate frameworks that are beginning to emerge. Mohammed, Ping, and Isaac, in their article on foresight and decoloniality, have advocated for dialogue between the AI metropoles and peripheries as a means of developing what they term intercultural ethics. They write that dialogue can facilitate reverse pedagogies, wherein the metropoles can learn from the peripheries, and that intercultural ethics emphasizes the limitations and coloniality of this idea of universal ethics, dominant rather than inclusive ethical frameworks, and finds an alternative in pluralism, pluriversal ethics, and local designs. Sibelo Mehlambi has taken this a step further by developing a framework for AI ethics based around the Southern African notion of Ubuntuism, and detailing how the notion of the relationality of personhood offers us an important framework for addressing some of the major challenges around data exploitation in particular, moving away from an individualistic data protection framework. Thompson Chengeta, a legal scholar from Zimbabwe, is exploring the notion of freedom ethics that's embedded within Article 19 of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights as a critical legal touchstone for responding to the challenges posed by AI-driven autonomous weapon systems, which is currently largely being considered within the more Western-conceived legal frameworks of international humanitarian law. And Article 19 stipulates that no one should be subject to oppression or oppressive regimes where they're denied their rights. These all ask us to reflect critically on what we understand and take to be ethical, and to extend this understanding through respect for diversity and difference. We can move to the next slide, please. So decolonial thought is far more than a tool to problematize artificial intelligence. It stands as an invocation to make intelligible, to critique, and to seek to undo the logics and politics of race and coloniality that continue to be put to work in technologies and imaginaries associated with AI in ways that exclude, delimit, and degrade other ways of knowing, living, and being that do not ascribe to the hegemony of Western reason. Decoloniality is located and it is specific. It is about the production of race and divided worlds. It is about power and the precise effects of power on being in the world today. It is about knowledge and how knowledge is ascribed legitimacy and value. And it is about a politics of resistance that enters and does the object of its critique. This includes, as I've outlined above in relation to ethics in particular, the discourses that rationalize and indeed obscure the history and effects of AI. Decoloniality also suggests its own fulfillment in the realization of a world where the lasting power and power effects of colonialism have been truly reckoned with and abolished, and a new form of human government that inhabits a true human community of the world installed. What this might look like and what kind of ethics is required to transcend the self-concerned individualism promoted by AI today. This is particularly important given the radical and dangerous individualism and complete human autonomy for some groups that AI is making and seeking to make possible. In engaging these questions, we must consider what the true ethical concerns of AI are and how decoloniality can help us articulate and address them. For Frantz Fanon, ethics was lived in the natives' refusal of the ways and the ideas of the colonial. Fanon writes, no professor of ethics, no priest has ever come to be beaten in the native's place, nor to share their bread with him. As far as the native is concerned, morality is very concrete. It is to silence the settler's defiance, to break his flaunting violence, in a word, to put him out of the picture. The violence Fanon calls for is constitutive to the creation of a new decolonized world. This violence, as is all violence, is essential. It takes place in the violation and transgression of a human law. Fanon's call for violence holds a deep importance that is central to the task of decolonization. In the context of the often hidden violence of artificial intelligence, in the slow, automated violence of its sorting and divided systems, our task is to consider what counter-violence is needed to break free from its bonds. I will pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this very, very interesting conference. There is a lot of questions I have in head, but maybe I can, first of all, remind you that if you have any question, can you write it in a Q&R section? And if you have also a question in French, please do, and we will translate it for you. Maybe Celine, you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Rachel. It was really inspiring and very interesting. Firstly, I would like to ask a very broad question. I'm curious because in your presentation, you talk about ethics and rule of law. And because I'm a lawyer, I was wondering what you have in mind and what kind of links you would like to bring together between ethics and rule of law. And after that, I will have other questions, but that's my first one.
Karine, shall I respond?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Celine. To be honest, it's an area where I didn't have time to go into it in detail. What I've been looking at is the effects of the GDPR and the new standards, the new legal standards around data governance, data protection, and by extension, artificial intelligence that are largely coming out of Europe and the effects that they are having on the African region. So one of the very direct kind of implications of the GDPR, because of its extraterritorial application, is that there's no data sharing allowed or permissible between many African countries, none of which would have, even the ones with data protection laws, none of them would be considered adequate according to the GDPR standard. So it's limiting data sharing between the two regions in a way that's really disadvantageous to Africa, particularly to African research. So a lot of research data cannot be fully de-anonymized, fully anonymized, and so is subject to the GDPR because it contains some kind of personal information. And it's had a very serious effect on a whole load of research projects involving data and research coming out of African institutions, not being able to participate in this kind of global market. So that was the area where I'd wanted to spend a bit of time. But for the sake of the presentation, it seemed a little bit too much in its own kind of area to explore. But happy to talk more on that if that's of interest.
Yes, that's very interesting, and data protection is one of my topics. So of course, I would be more than happy to talk with you about that. And in my knowledge, I think there are initiatives from data protection authorities in Africa to try to frame, to have a common legal framework on data protection. And there are some initiatives from Francophone and Anglophone Africa both. And I think it's very interesting to see the impact of an outside legislation, the impact around the world. And I think that's another kind of colonization by the law. And I think that's an interesting point as well for this reason. And regarding ethics, I agree with you. Ethics is a kind of tool of oppression, and more than that, I think that is also the case for Global North. It's also a tool of oppression because ethics is very broad and not very well defined, and you can consider ethics consideration to oppress someone else, or based on ethics you can avoid some question, or you can reframe the world. And I think that's also the case in global North regarding certain kind of communities or vulnerabilities. And I was wondering if you would like to, if you have already made comparison between vulnerabilities in global North and the relationship between global North and global South.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the starting point is that I don't take global North and global South to designate geographic regions, but to designate historically oppressed communities wherever they reside. So yes, absolutely, I'm very interested in the kind of ways in which AI is oppressing groups of people in the global North, and the relationship there between kind of historical ideas of historical practices of colonialism and the way in which decoloniality has can help us conceptually to articulate some of these problems. But it also, you know, these questions of colonialism and decoloniality very often come back to the question of who is the colonizer. And within this complex space of artificial intelligence, where we have big tech and we have China and we have America as very dominant players, and then we have Europe in a kind of separate space because it's not the main producer of AI technologies, but it is seeking to be at the forefront of AI laws and ethics. This question of who is the colonizer and where is that imperial center, which is important for tackling it and for critiquing and undoing it, but it becomes very, very complex. So this is the kind of richness that my work is working through and sitting with at the moment. And I think that comparison between what's taking place in countries of the global north with respect to the oppression being suffered at the hands or because of the practices associated with artificial intelligence. And that's happening in the global south, which do look quite different. They involve bigger structural, more environmental kind of concerns and risks too, is a very helpful way of trying to address this question of where the imperial center of AI sits, or how that matrix can be mapped and made sense of.
And what kind of power as well? Because yes. in Europe, I think the law is a kind of power, and the technology in the US and China is another kind of power. My last question, because I see Karin would like to ask some question as well. My last question is about the data location and the location of AI and local design. I like this idea, and I totally agree. And in the AI Act, the European proposal regulation on AI, there is a provision regarding the location of data. And especially, I think the AI system is more accurate and more efficient if we use some data related to the person to whom the system would apply. And that is exactly this idea in the AI Act. And I was wondering if you could think about a solution regarding the data, because on the one hand, as you mentioned, there are several legislation in Africa based on the GDPR. And on the other hand, you can see that it could be an obstacle because we also need to share information and data. But on the other hand, it's also a way to protect data and maybe to avoid a kind of abuse based on the collect of data. What do you think about this idea?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Celine. So there's been in a number of African countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and particularly South Africa, this policy shift to consider data localization, as in the legal mechanisms to ensure that data stays within the territory, although it may leave to a copy must stay here. And it is, in many respects, a response to how big tech is operating in these countries in a way that doesn't serve local economic needs. So they may not have many staff here or many offices, and they're not contributing that much to local economy. So the governments think, well, how can we use the kind of big resources at the hands of big tech to have something that is useful for us? But of course, the storage of data is not where the value of data lies. It lies in its sharing and its movement and its use and the analytics we can get from it. That's not really being recognized. I mean, certainly within the draft South African policy, the language was around data ownership, which is really far away from the idea of data stewardship that we want to be working towards. So data ownership, and then there's kind of worries around surveillance and what this data is used for, who has access to it internally. Just because it's within a country doesn't mean it's with the groups that we really want to empower. And then on the other side, yes, developing local AI solutions is the kind of key response to some of this kind of big tech phenomenon, and the fact that we cannot be subject to AI systems that have been developed against very different experiences of life, so are going to be biased. But to develop local AI requires enormous infrastructure, an infrastructure that is largely only available in the global north. The skills, the electricity, the constant internet connection, the long history of record keeping and sorting and categorizing data. So all of this is effectively, you know, the global south is just so positioned in a way that they cannot take advantage of this kind of so-called power and might and opportunity of artificial intelligence without a real focus on the basic digital infrastructure, and alongside it, what people know about how their data is used. Do communities understand artificial intelligence and the impact that it's having on them? Do they know when they go on their smartphone that their data is being collected and used for this different purposes, and they might have an option to opt out? And one of the major findings of the book we wrote on human rights in the 4IR in South Africa was that there's such a significant lack of awareness and understanding that there's no meaningful access to digital rights because people don't know their digital rights and therefore don't know how to claim them or challenge and defend them. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Maybe we will switch to the participant, the audience. I just have a very quick question about the role of civil society in that discussion of AI, ethics, and decolonization. You were mentioning about the work of Timmy Gibru and Joy Erawamini and Algorithm Justice League, for example, who has been a strong advocate on decolonization and a more fair principle and accountability. What is about in, for example, South Africa, the role of civil society in that kind of discussion? And right after Aideen, maybe we can switch to the question of the audience.
Shall I respond to you now, Karine? Or okay, so what we're finding is that there are some amazing standout organizations across the continent who are doing really kind of leading work, trying to be the middle ground between the communities and the governments, but also the kind of array of international stakeholders that are interested in this. But they are few and far between and not well funded enough. So the extent of their work is limited. There's a real lack of visibility of the work that is happening on the African continent, and same for much of the global south. Lack of visibility of this experience and this expertise in global debates and discussions, but they play such an important role in raising awareness and being that in between the communities and the experiences on the ground and the governments and the policy making. Yeah.
Thank you for your answer, Rachel. So let's jump into some of the audience questions. So we have a question here, which goes like, can you share on the topic of smart cities and how this notion may play a part in digital colonization?
Sure. I mean, there's some interesting work coming out in relation to Uganda, Rwanda, smart cities in East Africa, and the extent to which they are incorporating particularly facial recognition, but certainly surveillance technologies coming from particularly Chinese companies who are providing both the infrastructure and the kind of systems and software. There's a mismatch. There's a real mismatch in, I taught a group of students in Yaoundé in Cameroon who spoke about how in Yaoundé, there's all these facial recognition cameras on the streets, but there's rubbish everywhere and nobody is picking up and collecting the rubbish. So technology and the kind of promise of AI is bringing about a really kind of radical disjuncture between what is being told that that African cities might need in terms of this wonderful surveillance technology and what they actually need in terms of delivery of basic socio-economic rights, water, sanitation, education, and so forth. There's been some interesting work from colleagues of mine in Egypt, in Cairo, around smart cities and the extent to which smart cities may be a useful mechanism for monitoring and addressing pollution-related climate change. So that's perhaps a more positive example that I can give there.
Thank you. And we have another question, which is a very broad. Well, what would decolonizing IA look like in the healthcare context?
Great question. I think that, you know, the immediate thing with healthcare is that we often are very set within very formal ways of thinking about the provision of healthcare. So some of the problematics around AI being used within healthcare to establish kind of normative systems means that traditional medicine and traditional healing becomes more and more marginalized. Of course, in the healthcare context, we're talking about a greater level of risk of personal data. The personal data that's used and processed within a healthcare setting can be is more sensitive. So it carries more risks. And I think we've seen many of the kind of gendered and racial problematics coming out of COVID. So that's a clear one. And then that question of the kind of GDPR and the imperialism of the GDPR preventing African data from being included within universal healthcare data sets and healthcare research, which means this group of people are not getting adequate healthcare or just not, you know, not fitting healthcare recommendations where AI is playing a role, is another kind of area that I think is where these problems arise.
And we have a question related to ethics that we were discussing before, which is, who are the principal actors of the ethics of artificial intelligence?
That's a wonderful and interesting question, because ethics is about action. It is about ethics is a practice. Ethics isn't the writing of principles. It's the way in which you live and behave, whether you are an institution or a company, but it is the agency and action in social life. So who are the actors in the AI ethics discourse or practice is possibly big tech and governments that are employing artificial intelligence, whether ethically or not ethically. So I say that, but I am also, you know, working closely with UNESCO, whose recommendation on AI ethics, I think, is a really kind of meaningful marker towards something much more collectively representative. And I say that because the kind of suite of values that it speaks about is really not just kind of focused on individual rights and almost kind of corporate governance type of ideas. It's more about kind of things like diversity, labor rights, socioeconomic questions, the environment and the rights of future generations, protecting diverse knowledges, protecting the autonomy of the individual to think for themselves and not to be subject to forms of manipulation. And the process for that, the development of that recommendation was, I was involved in it a while ago, but it was a kind of 2-year process that was far more consultative of the global south than anything that has been developed to date. So I think certainly watch that space, and hopefully positive action will come out of that group.
Thank you for that answer. If we continue, we have also another question concerning ethics. So given your analysis, what do you think of ethics statements such as the Montreal Declaration on IA?
Yeah, I mean, ethics statements are just a statement, so it depends on the extent to which an ethics statement influences practice. I also think that ethics is something that we never know the full extent of ethical issues that may arise from these new technologies. We're never fully there. So it does require a kind of constantly reflective practice of thinking through with as broad a group of people as possible where might ethical issues be produced in what we're doing. So perhaps if ethical statements helped shape that kind of corporate practice, then they can be meaningful, but in and of themselves, it's just words. It just helps us articulate the beginning of a problem rather than the end or the solution.
Thank you. And let's move to the other question, which is, can you share some of the organizations that are tackling IA ethics within the civil society on the continent of Africa?
Yes, I will happily share a list. Of course, Research ICT Africa is working in this space. I can think of, policy in Uganda that's doing some amazing stuff. We are working. We've received a grant from the IDRC, the International Development Research Center, to establish an African observatory on responsible artificial intelligence. And one of the key things that this observatory is trying to do is to connect up the various different organizations across Francophone and Anglophone, even Arabophone, and Lusophone Africa that are working on these issues to raise their visibility, to raise the visibility of the AI ethics researchers on the continent. There's also CIPID at the University of Strathmore in Kenya. There's a number of different groups, but I'll put the website for the African Observatory in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. And I think we have two other questions, and just also feel free if you have questions to send them directly to the Q&A. We still have a couple of times. So someone is wondering if there is any work being done in terms of solutions. And the person gives an example for the acknowledgement of African societies about the usage of their personal data. And also if we are thinking about indicators to measure any improvement in these issues that you clearly mentioned during your presentation.
Yeah, so another project that I am working on, which has been really, really interesting for a kind of decolonial scholar to work on, is the Global Index on Responsible AI. We're very much in the design phase of this project, but it seeks really to kind of do that work of establishing a series of human rights-based indicators, and we mean human rights in the fullest sense, from civil liberties to children's rights and labor rights, community rights, business and human rights, but to establish a series of indicators that arise out of consultation largely with the Global South, but not entirely. It's a global index, but to really take into account the needs and perspectives and experiences of different Global South actors, and establish an index by which we can progressively understand and track movement from principles to practice in AI ethics, and thinking differently too with this idea of principles, but really kind of trying to see where we can identify best practice, where we can identify capacity needs, where we can focus international funding and cooperation. So I hope that the Global Index is a project that kind of speaks to that particular question. And I'll also put a website in the chat where you can learn more about the Global Index, because it will be trying to ascertain, get primary data from over 120, 130 countries around the world. So really filling some of those major data gaps that we have.
Thank you for your answer. And again, we have another question. Let me just see here.
Maybe we can take one or two questions and then close the conference, if it's okay.
Perfect. Yes, definitely. So the question is, do you think that artificial intelligence should acquire legal personality?
No, no, I don't think it should. It should have legal personality. We haven't given legal personality and agency and rights to all the people in this world, and we need to concentrate there first. Yeah, it becomes a very, very tricky matter when we start thinking about AI as a person. It becomes a normative endeavor. It is highly racialized and gendered and extremely problematic. So we need to be thinking of other forms of accountability that exist or that don't yet exist within our legal systems. And I think it would be a way to hide behind oppressive action if we were to give AI legal personhood, as has happened, I believe, in South Africa recently. There was an IP that was a patent that was developed by an AI, and it was registered as being developed by the AI. So it's an interesting question, but yeah, that's my position on it.
If I may, I totally agree, Rachel, because even if we have legal person and natural person, legal persons such as companies, the question is very different here, because if we do not have, if we will have a personality for a robot, let's say for robots, for instance, there is a question, there is a problem with the financial capabilities, and it's the more important problem. It's not, I think it's not a moral problem, but it's a question to know what kind of problem we would like to solve. And I think the legal personality won't solve anything. And regarding the painting and the copyright and author rights, authorship, we also have many jurisdictions which decide that have decided not to recognize any copyrights for this kind of creation. So I think it's reasonable not to go in this go this way.
It's very interesting because, you know, the idea of the juristic person was a legal concept that was designed so that the juristic person could own property. Mm-hmm. And then we get into questions around rent seeking and the associations between kind of rent seeking and property ownership and capitalism and colonialism. So it's a complex terrain for sure.
I totally agree.
Yes, that's really interesting. And let's finish on a last question, where someone asked you if you could speak a bit about the concept of human in the loop, human out of the loop, human on the loop with respect to IA ethics, accountability, responsibility, and how this might sit within research and debate on decolonizing, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I haven't looked into this kind of tool or provision in a great detail. For me, it's an easy way to kind of get out of these questions of autonomous AI systems, but it's always a matter of who is the human. it's an important area to be critical of, and it's never enough in itself, never enough in itself just to have a human in the loop. It's just an easy thing to say, I think.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. Really, I want to applaud you because it was really fantastic and very enriching. Thank you, everybody, for all your questions. I know that we did not pass to Rachel all our questions, but after we will do that after the conference. Please feel free to engage with her, maybe on Twitter or contact her directly. I think email address was on the slide. The conference also is, what is the word in English? Recorded, sorry. So you will be able to look at the second time at the presentation. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your time, for your very fantastic presentation. It was phenomenal. I hope that we will be able to collaborate with you on a more personal note, but very interesting. Thank you so much for the people. You have like Lise Langroy saying hi to you. I know that you know her. Thank you. Thank you, Celine. Thank you, Edine. And see you next time for the next conference of VIA. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks very much for having me.
Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.